and welcome to all of you to this year's iteration of the Albert Jean de Grandpré Distinguished Speaker Seminar Series. My name is Anja Geitmann, and I'm the Dean of the McGill's Faculty of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences. If you joined us by Zoom, your video is off and you're muted. And you may wish to click on Speaker View in order to get the speaker larger on screen. In order to pose questions, I therefore invite you to submit these through the chat function once we get towards the end of the session. You find the chat function at the bottom of the screen. Professor Grant Clark will assist me by monitoring the chat box, and Ingrid Shiraz of the Office for Student Academic Affairs will be assisting. This is the Grandpré Seminar Series. The Grandpré Seminar Series was launched in 2013 to honor Chancellor Emeritus Albert Jean de Grandpré, who served from 1984 to 91, a long-standing member of the McGill Board of Governors, and of course, one of Canada's most distinguished business leaders. He will actually celebrate his 99th birthday in a few days, and we wish him all the best. It is wonderful that members of his family, Lily and Francois, are with us this evening. The Faculty of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences is the steward of this lecture series, and I welcome several of the members of the Faculty Advisory Board among our listeners today, including Eric Gosselin, the chair of the board. Welcome. The mission of the faculty is to promote innovative research, educate the next generation of leaders, and discover sustainable solutions for tomorrow. This requires thinking beyond the limited horizon of our own disciplines. It requires bridging conceptual boundaries and connecting dots. Today's iteration of the De Grandpré Speaker Series is the inaugural seminar in another series run by the faculty, the Food for Thought Public Lecture Series. I'm delighted to be the moderator of today's event. Today, we will discuss sustainability of agriculture and food supply chains. You noted immediately, of course, that this is a highly timely topic, and the subtitle of today's event spells it out: Building Back Better After COVID-19. We're looking forward to a lively discussion, not only from our panelists, but from you, the audience, as well. I'm excited to introduce today's speakers. All three will start off this event by giving us a 10-minute presentation each, and we will then follow up with a discussion during which you have the opportunity to ask questions. Let me introduce our three speakers. Evan Fraser is the director of the Arrell Food Institute and professor of geography at the University of Guelph. Professor Fraser's work focuses on developing solutions to help feed the world's growing population, while not destroying the ecosystem on which we depend for life. For this purpose, he brings together a large multidisciplinary teams. Between 2006 and 2018, he co-convened an ad hoc working group made up of producer groups, the food industry, philanthropy, and civil create a National Food Policy Advisory Council. The creation of this council was announced by the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada last year. Professor Fraser helps lead the Food for Thought initiative, which is a multi-million-dollar research program based at the University of Guelph that explores how to use big data to reduce agriculture's environmental footprint. Welcome, Professor Fraser. Dr. Aurélie Harou is an assistant professor in agricultural economics in the Department of Natural Resource Sciences in our own faculty. She worked for the US Federal Emergency Management Agency on the National Flood Insurance Program, and later as a consultant for an economics litigation company in Berkeley, California. After living in the Democratic Republic of Congo for a year doing humanitarian work for the Action Against Hunger, she pursued a PhD in applied economics at Cornell University. Her research focuses on understanding smallholder farmer behavior as it relates to the adoption of yield-enhancing agricultural technologies. She also examines how economic, political, climatic, and health shocks affect human welfare, nutrition, and household consumption, as well as production decisions. Welcome, Professor Harou. The third member of our panel is Dr. Addy. He's the Associate Director and Senior Outreach Advisor in the Office of McGill's Deputy Provost, Student Life and Learning. In this role, he develops, manages, and assesses cross-sector partnerships, training and applied research spanning academia, business, government, and civil society. His activities support the transition of McGill MasterCard Foundation scholars from academic studies to entrepreneurship and employment for impact in Africa. Dr. Addy also teaches at the Max Bell School of Public Policy and in the African Studies program. He's an associate member of the Faculty of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences and of the School of Continuing Studies. Dr. Addy's interdisciplinary work focuses on institutional change and multi-stakeholder partnerships across societal and industrial sectors. His current projects promote entrepreneurship for improvements in agri-food, nutrition, and health in North America and Sub-Saharan Africa, as we will hear later. You see that we have assembled a great and complementary group of people, and I now invite Professor Fraser to start us off with his presentation. He will set the stage by discussing how COVID-19 impacted the food system. The other two speakers will follow immediately, and then we will have a joint question and answer period following the third presentation. Professor Fraser, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dean Ankman. And nice to see everybody here. 89 participants. That's pretty darn good, I think. So congratulations to colleagues at the University of McGill, and thank you for the opportunity. Dr. Clark, also thank you to you for reaching out and inviting me. As Dean Geitmann just said, I'd like to use my introductory comments to really get into two key ideas with you. And the first is to reflect indeed on how COVID-19 has had what I think we have to say is a profound impact on our food system. And then in the last few minutes, I'm going to pivot slightly, and I want to start exploring with you how novel digital agricultural technologies may really play a role in addressing some of the problems illustrated by COVID. So with your permission, I'd like to take us all back to March of this year. And I think that most Canadians, certainly myself, have a distinct memory of the empty grocery store shelves fixed in our minds. Now speaking as someone who has never known scarcity and has lived a privileged life, the sight of those bare shelves really conjured in me a feeling of the pending apocalypse. I think in actual fact, the challenge of maintaining those store inventories in the face of all that panicked buying and skyrocketing demand, I think that will be seen as nothing more than a short-term issue. And the grocery store clerks, the food processors, the truckers, the farmers, I would say they worked quite heroically in order to bring back our supply chains, and that returned to fairly normal conditions quite quickly. But although the disruptions that we experienced as consumers in the grocery store was, I think, relatively short-lived, I really do think that the pandemic has revealed a lot about the food system. So this brings me to the second major effect, which was the effect of the pandemic on our supply chains. Now when our restaurants closed and the universities and the theaters and the sports halls all shuttered, there was a real change in our supply chains. We learned, for instance, and this is one of the funny little things that emerged over the last 6 months, we learned that the vast majority of the potatoes consumed in Canada are eaten in restaurants in the form of French fries. Now, potato farmers suffered horribly as their markets dried up. Similarly, farmers with contracts to sell milk to coffee shops had to dump their products. And with all of us cooped up at home, millions of Canadians discovered a passion for home baking. And we all, of course, remember that flour, eggs, yeast, things like that suddenly became scarce. But as these supply chains shifted, we also discovered strange hidden vulnerabilities. For instance, egg packaging became a major issue that caused a huge amount of waste. And this is actually quite simple. When a restaurant buys an egg, they typically buy in large volumes, and the eggs are shipped in flats of 144 individual eggs. But when you or I buy eggs, we typically buy them by the dozen. And so the closing of the restaurants meant that the egg industry actually found itself short of 1 dozen egg carton packages. So it wasn't so much a shortage of eggs as the shortage of the packing material that caused eggs to be dumped and made them scarce in the grocery store for weeks. And this illustrates, or is a sort of a metaphor for me, as to some of the strange hidden vulnerabilities that COVID has revealed. A third major effect of the pandemic on the food system was the impact, of course, on labor, both on our farms and specifically in the meat processing sector. So we have to acknowledge that relatively poorly compensated hand labor, much of which is done either by folks who come to Canada on temporary visas or are relatively new Canadians from places like the Philippines. This is the backbone of many parts of our food system. And early in the pandemic, as governments were considering travel bans, farm groups really began to be concerned, even panic, pointing out that each year approximately 60,000 people come to Canada from Latin America or the Caribbean, and they do everything from pruning our apple orchards to planting asparagus and picking strawberries. Now, the government responded by expediting visas and providing funding to farmers to help them retrofit dormitories to allow social distancing and quarantine periods. And so the workers did arrive, but not in the same numbers or with the same level of efficiency as normal. And when they did come to our country, many found themselves working and living in environments conducive to the spread of the disease. So some of the most persistent hotspots of COVID in Ontario have been linked with temporary foreign agricultural workers. A very similar situation unfolded in the meatpacking industry, where the environment of working in a meatpacking plant has been revealed as a major vulnerability. And at one point, many of us will remember that 3/4 of Canada's beef capacity was closed as workers had tested positive for the virus and plants had to shut. So not only was this terrible for the workers who were directly affected, it also illustrates how our extremely economically efficient just enough, just in time food system really started to struggle to adapt. And the problem with the meatpacking industry, for instance, is really, I think, that in an effort to chase greater economic efficiency and larger economies of scale, we have ended up in a situation where a very small number of meat processing facilities serve essentially continental-sized markets. And this frankly proved brittle in the face of the virus, causing not only disruption for consumers, but critically, really affecting farm income. The fourth major impact of the pandemic is on food insecurity. We already live in a country with unacceptably high levels of food insecurity, where approximately 1 in 10 Canadians regularly faces difficulty accessing healthy food. And the pandemic has had a really big impact on this. With lost wages, soaring unemployment, food banks have never been busier. And some of the major food banks in Canada, in particular Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, are reporting a doubling in the number of people requiring emergency food assistance. And then speaking at an international level, which is something that the other two speakers, Addy and Aurelie, will drill into in much more detail, we see the United Nations projecting that the number of hungry people who are expected to suffer from acute hunger in this world will actually double this year. And the head of the World Food Program announced about May that famines of biblical portions loom on the horizon due to this crisis. But a conclusion from this work is that food insecurity is rising not because we're not producing enough food or even because the disruptions in the distribution system are causing it. Rather, the problem is lost wages and unemployment. In other words, and I mean this very seriously, food security is a social and an economic issue and bears little relationship with production. Now, if I stand back from all these impacts, these four impacts, and I try to synthesize them, I would like to leave you with a few key conclusions before I talk about technology. First, I think we should all be proud, humble, and grateful as Canadians that our system did as well as it did, and that we have a fairly resilient system, especially given the scale of the perturbations we've just gone through. The second conclusion is that our dependency on hand labor, especially relatively poorly compensated hand labor, as a cornerstone of our system probably has to stop. And that means working with the sector to both better our labor standards, et cetera, but also maybe, and this might be controversial, but I think it's necessary to pivot away from using as much labor in the system as we do. Third, I think we need systems in place to allow the industry a better way of managing their supply chains, so we balance the efficiency of our current just enough, just in time processes with a greater understanding of the needs of resiliency. And fourth, we need to both try to repatriate food and reduce our reliance on imports, as well as decentralizing parts of our system. And finally, we have to recognize that food insecurity is only going to be meaningfully tackled through wages, employment, education. In other words, equity and social programming are necessary. Now, I know that Nii and Aurelie will talk in more detail about these issues, and in particular focus on work that they've underway in Africa. But in the last minute or two remaining to me for this introduction, let me pivot slightly and talk a bit about technology. And I think it's important for us all to recognize that along with these tremendous challenges we face in the food system, we're also facing a major transformation in terms of the technologies we use to produce food. And I believe that the same technologies that brought us the internet and are transforming medicine, in other words, big data, artificial intelligence, robotics, ICT, right now these data-driven tools are being applied in our farms and on our fields, in our food processing facilities. Now, I've spent a lot of my career studying these sort of technological trends, and I'm of the opinion, for instance, that vegetable production is in the process of being moved indoors under LED lighting systems and in the periphery of major cities. Another big trend, I think we're at the beginning stages of a protein revolution where we will increasingly see products coming on the market that function from like a consumer perspective or a culinary perspective in a way that's very similar to traditional livestock products, but maybe don't actually involve animals, cellular agriculture, in vitro meat, molecularly engineered ice cream. I also believe that we're on a trajectory where algorithms will make more and more of the decisions in terms of what to plant, where to apply fertilizer, and that when you take these technologies together, this revolution that some people call the digital agricultural revolution may result in more food being produced on less land, closer to the consumer, and with a smaller environmental footprint. Now, no matter where you stand on these debates, whether you look at these technologies as a utopian future or as an apocalyptic outcome of the current predicament, I actually don't think that matters. I think it's fairly well established that our species has a track record of letting technological genies out of bottles. And in my opinion, and I really mean this very, very seriously, I think it is inevitable that these technologies will increasingly be applied in our food system. And so what we need to do is be engaged in a serious debate about how to use these technologies to create a better system. And I think the pandemic highlights many of these issues. For instance, most of us like fresh strawberries, but right now our strawberry system depends on poorly compensated hand labor, long distance trade, and environmental exploitation, especially in California. It also doesn't really result in very good strawberries, and they aren't even particularly cheap. So I would argue that there's a lot wrong with the current picture. Properly done, however, I think that the near future will allow us the opportunity to produce much tastier strawberries, more or less autonomously within cities in so-called vertical farms, and even a place like Canada with its winter will be able to enjoy this. But to make sure we get to this sort of point, we have to be encouraging, technology companies to work with nutritionists and land use planners and poverty experts in order to ensure that we all take a holistic view of the food system. I think we need to bring public-private partnerships together rather than just assuming that the market will be driven to apply technologies in an appropriate way. So as I wrap this part of my talk up, as I fervently hope that if we allow ourselves to dream big, I think if we drop preconceived notions about what food systems should or maybe should not look like, if we all work to foster a lively dialogue and a collaborative approach to problem solving, then I really think that maybe we can start to address some of the problems in the food system, specifically problems that COVID has revealed, in a way that results in better nutrition, increased sustainability, and a more resilient food system. So with that, I'll thank you for your attention, and I'll pass the torch over to somebody else.
Thank you very much, Professor Fraser. You drew a very interesting line from the problems that we experienced a few months ago at the beginning of the pandemic, all the way to technological innovation that will have long-term impact. We will discuss these later, but first I'll give the word to Professor Aurélie Harou, who will draw that line even further and talk about global markets and in particular also the developing world.
Thank you so much, Evan, for that great talk, and Anja for the introduction and the invitation to speak today. So I'll shift focus a little bit and talk about the government response to COVID globally at the international level, focusing, as Dean Geitmann just said, on trade and economic policy. Now I'll focus internationally first and then end with looking at the African continent experience more specifically, which is where I do most of my work. And then I know that my colleague Me will speak more about the effects of the pandemic as experienced by smallholder agricultural households specifically. So in the same way that you and I likely started kind of stockpiling dry goods, canned goods, toilet paper, pasta, grains, etc., as the pandemic unfolded, to protect ourselves against the uncertainty of the pandemic, governments have done the same thing and tried to protect their populations by putting certain protective measures in place. And this has been particularly true in the case of medical supplies. So by March, there were about 24 countries that had restricted their exports of medical equipment, medicines, and all the inputs needed to create those medicines. And there's kind of three major problems with that kind of approach and that kind of reaction. The first is that countries that are most in need of certain goods may not be receiving those goods because of these restrictive measures that are put in place. The second is that such limits on exports might actually decrease global supply of goods that are desperately needed, because as you can imagine, if there's a restriction on exports, there's no incentive for producers of a certain country to continue and produce more of that good. And the third problem is that this kind of incentivizes other countries to adopt similar measures. And so there's kind of this catch-22 and this vicious cycle. So luckily, in terms of the pandemic, this kind of protective measure, these protective measures have been done more in terms of the medical equipment. And all industries have not been affected similarly. And luckily, our global food supply has not experienced such kind of export restrictions. And so what that means is that luckily, despite the kind of initial short-term effects that we all experience in supermarkets, we've been relatively fortunate in being able to consume the goods that we're accustomed to consuming at a stable price and a decent price. And this is in large part thanks to the flexibility that our current supply chains have been able to accommodate, not without some costs, as I'll get to in a little bit later, and also for certain government interventions. So for example, in February, China restricted its population from kind of traveling abroad in these large tourist groups, in New Zealand, for example. And in the past, these planes coming full of tourists from New Zealand would go back to China full of kiwis and other goods that New Zealand was exporting. Of course, when those people stopped coming, the planes going back to China full of those goods were no longer operational. So that's when the government of New Zealand, for example, intervened, subsidized, and gave a loan to Air New Zealand to continue that freight process so that they could continue to export. So certain governments have intervened appropriately in order to ensure that the food supply was continuing. So since the 1990s, there's been kind of this push towards globalization of, or not only our food systems, but in all different industries. This means that today about 4/5 of our population depend in some part on imports for food consumption, for the foods that we consume. So you might ask yourselves, why haven't we felt more of an effect given kind of the decrease in trade that's resulted from the pandemic, especially when you think recently to the 2007-2008 food crisis, where you might remember seeing kind of food riots happening in certain countries, especially Northern Africa, due to a sudden shift and increase in food prices. And there's a few reasons that we've been fortunate actually through this pandemic that we haven't experienced such crises in the food system. One is that we've had a really great year in terms of global production of foods this year. Our grain stocks are about twice what they were in 2007. Another factor has been the price of oil, which has been at a very low $30 a barrel compared. So shipping costs are about 20 times more or cheaper than they were in 2007. So the result is that, we've had continuing of our food system being able to kind of operate through this pandemic. And so, I'm painting this relatively optimistic picture so far of the effects of the pandemic on our food system. But of course, this is when we speak about the effect on average. And of course, certain industries have suffered more than others. products like grains and oils, which are easily transportable and easily stored, have had a higher or more easily adapted to short-term port closures, for example. Other products like perishable products like fruit, vegetables, meats, dairy, on the other hand, have suffered more. And that's why we've heard of certain cases where, for example, French fishermen have needed to throw 2/3 of their catch back into the ocean, or US and Canadian dairy farmers having to dump their milk, or having to feed their milk back to their cows. So not all industries, have been able to cope as well as some others have. So kind of conclude this portion of the kind of looking at global trade and the pandemic, I want to say that kind of the biggest effect of COVID has not really been felt as a result of any kind of new trade barriers that have been put in place by governments, luckily. Rather, what we've experienced is really a crashing and shifting demand. And so this decrease in economic opportunity and that we've experienced in our countries has meant that there's been a decrease in remittances from certain countries to about 20%. There's been a reduction in foreign direct investment of about 30 to 40%. And it's expected that the kind of quantity of trade will decrease by between 10 and 30%. And we've seen this and experienced this by seeing, long queues at food banks. In the US and several African countries, we've seen children that no longer get food at lunch through school feeding programs. And so these communities are particularly susceptible to small changes in prices. So again, it hasn't been a huge shift in the barriers to trade, but rather the shift in demand. And so I'll shift before handing the baton over to me a little bit and talking and focusing on the African continent. And as Evan mentioned, there's this expectation that the number of acutely hungry will double due to the pandemic. And this is particularly true, and most of these cases will be occurring in Africa. And for many countries in Africa, COVID is only kind of a crisis within a crisis. There's also been locust outbreaks in much of Eastern Africa affecting Ethiopia, Kenya, other countries in Eastern Africa. And many other countries are also plagued with conflict that have been ongoing, such as in Sudan or Eastern Congo. And so, in terms of trade and for Africa, about 1/4 of their food and grains are imported. And so when you talk about export restrictions in countries like Vietnam, for example, who earlier this year did in fact reduce and limit their exports, most of the rice received in Ghana comes from countries like Vietnam. And so any kind of barrier to trade is actually affecting countries who are net importers, many of whom are in Africa the most. So for those reasons, it's really important to kind of keep an open mind and kind of try to prevent and for kind of these natural protective tendencies in terms of in times of crisis, to remember kind of some of the benefits of keeping trade open in order to allow countries that are in need of those goods. So I'll leave it at that for the moment, and I'll hand it over to Nee.
Thank you very much, Professor Harou. So now we got the international aspect, and you already hinted at Africa, and we're getting more granular now by directing our attention more focused to Africa. So Nee, Addy, please, it is your turn now.
Thank you very much, Aurelie, and thank you very much, Evan. Thanks very much to Dean Geitmann and to the organizers of tonight's program. So what I'll do is I'll build off some of what my colleagues have talked about. And let me start by first reflecting a little bit more on how COVID-19 has influenced interactions. I'll be looking at interactions more at the micro level and then building out to the macro level as well. So we think about how first the COVID-19 situation has affected the interactions with food systems, with examples from the African context. The second thing that I would want us to do is, also building on what my colleagues started off with, explore how digital technologies in agri-food could play a role in addressing some of the food systems challenges that COVID-19 has laid bare. For discussing, what I want to do is draw on some examples from projects that I'm mostly involved in Ghana, that are focused on smallholder farmers and their households, as well as some projects by other colleagues. A key thing that I want to do and macro level factors is focusing on anxiety. And I'm thinking about anxiety along the lines of what ecological economist Tim Jackson, he highlights in his work on prosperity without growth. And what I mean by anxiety in that sense is anxiety that leads to tensions. So tensions that emerge during a crisis. We are anxious, and so we either become more protectionist and less collaborative, or we become more collaborative and we innovate. We enable entrepreneurship in food systems, including innovation in changing our policies and our norms. So anxiety, again, let me tell a story to illustrate. And it's a story that it caricatures the anxiety and the tensions that we face in our food systems at the household level, but along a continuum, even to the macro level, global food systems. And what happens with this anxiety is that those tensions play out in the decisions that we make individually and collectively. So here's my story. Once upon a time, there was a man, and this man had insecurities about his ability to survive without having a wife. There was also a woman who had insecurities about surviving without a husband. These two anxiety-filled people met and they got married. But instead of becoming more secure, they became more insecure. In the first case, scared of losing the woman, the man kept on demeaning her, abusing her in many overt and covert ways, including verbally, arguing that without him, she would be nothing. He kept on making demands of the woman to serve him without regard to her needs. On the part of the woman, scared of what might happen if she were not with a man, she also sought to please him in hopes of keeping him. And the way she did this is she kept on working and working and working and feeding him and feeding him and feeding him. Over time, the man became extremely obese, and then the woman became extremely undernourished. All the resources that they had amassed over time had to be used in treating their ailments, right? Their ailments that were related to their obesity, extreme obesity and undernourishment. Then COVID-19 struck. Now we all are aware of the toll that COVID-19 has taken, on economic and social relationships, but also the fact that COVID-19 has a great impact on people who have underlying health conditions. So think about this man who is extremely obese and this woman who is extremely undernourished. We can imagine their levels of anxiety now that COVID-19 has struck. This is a caricature, but let's think about how this plays out literally in some cases, in some of the communities that we work in, but also figuratively, at the household level in some communities. It plays out at a much more complex manner at the national levels. If you think about how you have urban food systems and rural food systems, the kinds of relationships they have with each other, where one becomes extremely obese and the other one becomes extremely undernourished. It plays out also at the global system. Let's think about the fact that you have rich industrialized countries where there's relatively high level of wastage, right? Particularly on the consumer side, while at the same time you have processing capacity, and there's undernutrition as a result. You have a situation where about the same, when it comes to rich countries produce, they waste about the same amount of food, about over 220 million tons of food as the entire net food production in sub-Saharan Africa, right? There are lots of inefficiencies, lots of imbalance in the system. So let us think about this story, you know, this man and this woman, both insecure, in a relationship which is not really helping them to become more secure. Another scenario, you can have another scenario where you have two insecure people, address the fact that they are both insecure, acknowledge those insecurities, and try to work things out in a more balanced manner. Now, that is another scenario that we have in front of us. We can decide that given the way things are in our global food system, given the way things are in our food systems within various countries, or given the way things are at the household level in the food systems that are faced within communities, we can look at how do we address our insecurities and anxieties, right? Especially in the face of a crisis. We can become more imbalanced. And that is what COVID-19 provides us with, if you want, that challenge. COVID-19 has laid bare the types of anxieties that we have and the insecurities. And here I'm talking about our anxieties as human beings, right? Stockpiling toilet paper, right? But it goes beyond toilet paper. It also speaks to anxieties in how we structure our food supply chains and our policies. It's making us more aware of complex relationships, complex dependencies, and we can either acknowledge them or we can downplay the role that other parts of the food systems play for us. The pandemic is also forcing us to make choices that we've been putting off. Now here, I'll focus more on the African context, as I've mentioned. In Africa, the pandemic is highlighting the important role of smallholder farming communities, but it's also highlighting the poverty that they face. 82% of poverty, of the poor in Africa, are rural. Most of them, and they are living in farming. At the same time, they are very often ignored. Prior to COVID-19, there have been a number of attempts that have been made at addressing the issue of poverty, particularly rural poverty in Africa, and addressing the needs of these smallholder farming communities. Very often, there hasn't been as much follow-up. COVID-19 is making us pay more attention to some degree. And I'll use an example of cocoa farmers in Ghana to illustrate. Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, next door to Ghana in West Africa, produce over 50% of the world's cocoa, right? But just given incentive structures that are faced, and given perceptions that are faced, you have some imbalances. And I think part of the question becomes, how do we address some of these imbalances moving forward? If you take a bar of chocolate, right, cocoa producing chocolate, you ask yourself, what are the incentive structures? How are the global food systems, agri-food systems shaped such that in a bar of chocolate, a farmer is actually accruing about 6% of the value of that bar of chocolate, and 70% of that value of that bar of chocolate is going to cocoa and chocolate companies, right? The farmer is working tirelessly, but is only accruing 6%. You know, what are the incentive structures that we have in place, right, in the food system, such that farmers also have a perception that instead of investing in growing fruits and vegetables, they'll rather grow cocoa, which is very intensive, and at the same time, they're living in poverty. Part of this comes from their own perceptions, right? Part of what we see then in the work, some of the work that I'm doing with colleagues in Ghana is this, that there is a need to make clear what are the values, what are the values that are accruing to different sectors in the economy. And when it comes to agri-food, who's making money across the different value chains? How do the incentive structures of their efforts in producing cocoa, for example, as opposed to producing fruits and vegetables? Part of what COVID is doing is this: it is forcing us to address how do we show the information about these food systems, and how do we then change the incentive structures such that in Africa, for example, there can be more value added to agricultural produce, so that farmers, for example, can also then recoup more of the value in products, things that are produced. A challenge then is this, that very often there hasn't been adequate investment in the supply chains. You don't have enough investment in, say, infrastructure for the supply chains. And COVID, given the situation with exports, the depression in export prices, is making it clear that African governments and other stakeholders have to invest much more in local processing of agricultural produce. For this to happen, though, there has to be some catalyzing of action. Part of what we see is that there's a perception of farming communities, for example, largely women-led rural farming communities, where there's a perception that it is too risky to invest in them. Part of what the work that colleagues that I'm working with in Ghana and other countries are doing is we are looking at catalyzing some of these investments in rural farming communities, particularly in women. With the COVID-19 situation, what we are seeing is there's more attention being paid to some of these rural communities. There is also a question of how technology can play a role. Again, once there were lockdowns and you had some of these rural communities cut away from markets, it became necessary that those living in urban areas understand that, yes, they really depended on these rural communities for their food, right? It became also important to provide support. And some of that support has happened in terms of providing technology, using digital technology to support how these rural farming communities can even access financing, right? So this is where the opportunity of COVID-19 comes in. Our anxieties are laid bare. Our insecurities are laid bare. What do? Do we invest in these rural communities, or do we actually sort of protect ourselves and keep on feeding ourselves so that we become extremely obese while they stay extremely undernourished? Just given time, I'll wrap it up here in terms of the technologies and some of what we are seeing. Because some of us who are working globally, and say in Canada, have been cut off, we were not able to be on the field in Ghana, for example, we've had to depend on technologies much more. Suddenly, we've been depending on WhatsApp platforms, where you have people like myself who might be removed, who might be at McGill, having to interact more closely with some of these rural farmers on a WhatsApp platform in Ghana. Whereas we were removed, now we are much more in touch over these technologies, using these digital technologies. Similarly, we have classes. What I'm seeing is cases where either through my classes or through workshops, we're having the chance for people, just like we are doing in this Zoom series, having people connect from different countries, people who would not have connected in the past, right? So suddenly, this crisis is having us connect with each other in ways that we never thought was possible, right? And so these are some of the things that, make me think about what are the possibilities. But these are decision points. We're going to have to decide whether we either remain anxious and not connect, or we're going to get over anxieties and collaborate. So I'll leave it at this, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk a little bit more about where this anxiety takes us, whether we collaborate or whether we cut things off. So I'll end here.
Thank you, Dr. Addy. This was a really interesting segue, the connectivity, right, to what we are doing here right now on screen. So I am now inviting the audience to send questions. You can do so through the chat function, which we will monitor, and then we will pose the questions to the speakers. It would help enormously if you identified the speaker you want to pose the question to, if the question is targeted to a particular person, and so that we know whom to give the word. So I invite you to submit questions through the chat, and Grant Clark will monitor the chat function. To kick off that question period, I'm going to start myself with a question. And the question is really addressed to all of you, but I think I'm going to give Professor Harou the word first. You've all described how the pandemic has affected our lives, both at home, in our daily lives, in Africa and households, but also at international trade level. I've learned that you never should let a catastrophe go to waste. And so what is it that we can learn from this pandemic? How can we build our food system that is more resilient in the future and possibly able to weather even stronger storms? I'm thinking of the big one looming in the background, which is of course climate change. But what in general can or should we do in order to make our food system more resilient? Professor Harou, do you want to chime in first?
Yes, thank you, absolutely. I think I'll piggyback a little bit on some of what you just talked about in terms of talking about this anxiety, which can be felt really at, at a personal level, but also in terms of kind of government responses. And so I spoke earlier of this kind of tendency during crises to adopt some protectionist measures. And some might argue that that's started since, even the 07-08 crisis, where countries started kind of imposing these import and export restrictions. And I think adopting that kind of mentality can be dangerous for reasons I tried to kind of explain earlier, where there's usually advantages and reasons that economists tend to promote trade, and that it allows us to consume a more diverse portfolio of goods. You can think of now versus 30 years ago, you didn't have access to the same kind of products in supermarkets. And that's in part large to this kind of globalization that happened during the 90s. And also the prices of those goods with trade can decrease. And so you're benefiting the consumer as well as producer. So instead of kind of adopting these protectionist measures, there's definitely though been an apparent kind of issue that's come up with this pandemic where you don't have access to certain goods because of the crisis and closures of certain industries. So what there has been kind of discussion about is expanding the supply chain and not just focusing on certain producers, but rather kind of diversifying that supply chain. So instead of procuring certain inputs from one particular location, is kind of getting those inputs from different industries or different plants, manufacturing plants, for example. And I say that, when you think about it, that seems kind of like a natural thing to do. When you talk about investment of your assets, you're talking about diversification. You want to kind of minimize your risk. So you might wonder, well, why hasn't this been done before? But there is a cost to kind of diversification. There's a reason that a lot of the medical equipment is currently produced in China, is that they can produce those goods most cheaply. So there is a cost to also kind of trying to diversify the supply chain. But I think that a diversification of the supply chain would be preferable than kind of this mentality of wanting to close borders and try to produce everything within closed borders.
Thank you, Professor Harou. Professor Fraser, I suspect that you might want to chime in on this question as well. How can the system become more resilient?
So I'm going to take us back to about 4 years ago, when early in the first Trudeau mandate, then Finance Minister Bill Morneau convened an advisory council for economic growth that was given a mandate to make recommendations to Cabinet that would grow Canada's economy and position us on a better economic footing. And one of the things that they said was that agriculture is quite literally low-hanging fruit in terms of economic investment opportunities. It's got this tremendous amount of innovation that hasn't yet been applied in the sector. that Canada already has a reputation for producing safe food. We could trade on that reputation, bolster it. And they articulated a vision for our country that we should be the world's premier supplier of trusted, safe, and sustainable food. And they were very deliberate in using the words trusted, safe, and sustainable. And I think that we can do well by doing good, and we should be putting agriculture, and particularly the production of trusted, safe, and sustainable food, at the cornerstone of a green recovery plan. So if I was asked to hold the pen on the throne speech that'll come out in a couple of weeks, and I'm absolutely not being asked to hold the pen, so I'm joking, but if I was being asked to hold that pen, I would say focus on curating the safest, the most trusted, and the most sustainable food. Trade that as a brand asset for our country. Develop the technologies and the data systems and the underpinnings of that, and you will not only have a better fed domestic population, you will also have an export growth strategy that our country can pursue. Now, that is a very Canadian-focused answer, but I know that that my co-panelists will answer from a more international perspective.
Thank you, Professor Fraser. Dr. Addy, staying with the resiliency, how can we develop and sustain the cross-sector partnerships that are needed to build a resilient food system in the future?
Yeah, so I think part of doing that is illustrating the dependencies that we have, right? And showing clearly how do the different stakeholders benefit by collaborating over time. One of the things that also comes up, and we see this in some of the projects that I'm involved in, is how building trust, and that occurs over time. And maybe touching on what Evan just said, ultimately there's a brand. Canada particularly has a role to play when it comes to that. And we're seeing this, and how we build trust enables some of these collaborations to continue and to be sustained.
Thank you. I'm gonna check in with our support system, and that is Dr. Grant Clark, who reads the questions, Grant, can I give you the word? Are there questions from the audience?
Sure, and I have to apologize in advance to the audience. We likely won't have time to get to all of your questions, but there is one directed to Dr. Fraser, and the question is, how can we account for resources required for the technologies you mentioned that might reduce human labor? And the concern here is about the extraction of resources and use of energy to implement those technologies, and also the impact on our connection with our food supply as humans.
So, phenomenally good question, revealing some fundamental trade-offs that we as a society and as individual consumers have to grapple with. So yes, one of the big problems associated with the digital agricultural revolution, and although I may sound like a big booster for the digital agricultural revolution, I'm also able to take a critical look at it as well. One of the big challenges is that it increasingly divorces people from their food. Now, I would say that horse may have already left the barn, and we are right now in a situation where, one farmer can, at least in grains and oilseeds and legumes, farm 10 or 20,000 hectares. So we're already pretty divorced from the farm, most of us, and an autonomous indoor strawberry producing facility probably will accelerate that trend. So if you acknowledge that is a risk associated with the brave new digital world, then you have to think, okay, how do we put countervailing programs in place to counteract that risk? So at the same time as we, with one part of our policy portfolio, embrace or move towards a vertical farm on the outskirts of Toronto or Montreal to produce our strawberries and our lettuce, we should also be investing in a school nutrition program that connects small-scale farmers with our primary schools. And there's no reason why those two policies can't actually simultaneously exist. One will be providing low-cost fruits and vegetables for consumers out of grocery stores, and the other will serve an educational function and a local landscape protection function. So I think we can get at the human detachment issue in some ways by thinking of a policy portfolio of issues. The question of actually how do we build the technologies in such a way that we actually do derive sustainability benefits from is also a very, very, very important question. And I think in order to address that, in order to ensure that these hypothetical fruits and vegetables produced in vertical farms or these hypothetical cellular agricultural products produced in laboratories actually do deliver a sustainability benefit, we have to be taking a holistic perspective on design. And in particular, if we can situate vertical farms or greenhouses adjacent to industrial facilities where there's a lot of waste heat and a lot of waste carbon dioxide, then we should be able to trap the waste heat and the waste carbon dioxide, the waste organics from a city's, waste stream, and we can use those waste products in a circular economy kind of way as inputs into a vertical or controlled environment system. Now that's, again, the technological utopian answer, and there's a tremendous amount of complexity to get to that vision, but ultimately the idea of a closed loop agricultural system, at least for fruits and vegetables within the context of an urban farm, should be possible, and it should be done largely using waste components that cities produce a lot of waste of, which is heat, carbon dioxide, and organics.
Great, thank you very much. Dr. Addy, somebody has thrown you a slow ball here. They're asking if you could speak a bit more about the incentive structures you were discussing in rural farming communities, and what those incentives would look like specifically.
Yeah, so maybe very quickly, part of what we see is there's a lack of understanding of the economics by some of the rural farming communities. So part of what we're doing then is providing information that makes it clearer to these rural farming communities where should they invest their efforts, right? And that is one of the ways in which we try to even the playing field. So straighten out which direction that the farmer is going to. The other one also has to do with just the global system, right? And what is the pricing structure that we have? Again, making sure that some of the pricing structure there's transparency about the pricing structures. So that's one way of looking at the incentive structures.
All right, thank you. Aurelie, I'm going to send one more in your direction here. The question is, well, first there's a little preface saying that commercial enterprises are often more agile than governments. Do you have examples of progressive enterprises that have leveraged their capabilities to feed themselves while also helping rural areas in Africa?
What? Sorry, while also what?
While also helping rural areas in Africa.
Okay, thank you. So I think this speaks to actually a lot of the kind of tech revolution that we're seeing in agriculture generally, and this brings us to a point that I've been observing throughout this talk, is that we're talking about this promotion of agricultural technology, which is really helpful and really great and has a lot of potential, but I think there also needs to be a discussion about not letting kind of those in Africa and those rural communities kind of fall behind and not being able to keep up with some of those technologies. So there's definitely, I think, a lot of scope for some of the technologies to be adapted and adopted in Africa, but we're not seeing that so much, especially in terms of kind of yields. When you look at African farmers, they have about 1 ton per hectare compared to grain farmers in the US and Canada, who are at about 8 or 9 tons per hectare. So for certain technologies, there's still a lot of work to be done to kind of catch those rural communities up. But there is kind of a technology revolution occurring in Africa in terms of kind of information communication technologies and access to information. And so there's been a lot of work, for example, on e-commerce and accessing money markets through cell phones, and especially with, increasing access to smartphones, kind of a host of other technologies that some farmers do have access to. So I'm not sure I fully answered the question, but.
Well, there's a little follow-up actually,
okay,
which is related. And the question is, has any major company stepped up to help with this kind of enabling innovation?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of the telecom industry who are kind of interacting on multiple levels. So as I mentioned, areas in Kenya and Tanzania have M-Pesa, so the ability for farmers to send each other money. So that's really revolutionized kind of the banking sector in Tanzania. So I think the telecom industry in particular, again, as I mentioned earlier, I think there's a lot more to be done in terms of the technologies surrounding agriculture. You know, tractors, just mechanization of different processes throughout the production cycle are really lacking in a lot of these communities.
Okay, thank you very much. So again, I apologize to the audience that we can't reach all of your questions and discuss all of them. But at this point, I'll turn it back over to Dean Geitmann so we can start with the concluding addresses from the panelists.
Thank you, Professor Clark. I think what I would like now to do is invite our panelists to give sort of a final word and summary. Now that they actually heard each other presentations as well, they can give a context and maybe amend their own presentation with supplementary information and wise words that we can then take and mull over. So I'm going to order this in the same order that we had before. I'm going to start with you, Professor Fraser.
Super. Well, thanks. An anecdote to close, to respond to Nee's story. My grandfather on my dad's side was a vegetable farmer in Niagara. And as a teenager, I would spend summers working with him. And I remember spending hours standing on the back of the old Massey Ferguson tractor, and Grandpa would drive slowly through the sweet corns, the melons, the strawberries. And one of my jobs was to throw handfuls of fertilizer pellets onto those fields. Now, with the benefit of hindsight and a PhD in agriculture, I'm going to guess that 50% of the fertilizer I threw off the back of that tractor never was used by the crops. It didn't land in the right place or the right time for the plants that we wanted to grow to be used. And then probably a bunch of it ended up being washed into the groundwater, where it ended up in Lake Erie, where it's probably contributed to the problems of eutrophication in that lake. Alternatively, it might have ended up in the atmosphere, where it currently probably sits as a greenhouse gas, contributing to global warming. That was then, way back in the dark ages of the 1990s. Today, that scene wouldn't probably occur. The smart tractors that know where they are in the fields and use sophisticated onboard soil maps and weather forecasts are much more efficient at throwing fertilizer around than a 16-year-old hanging out with his grandfather. Maybe no human connection there, but more efficient application of fertilizer. Those hoped-for vertical farms I've been talking about, where the waste heat and the carbon dioxide are trapped from industrial facilities and piped into greenhouses that recycle water. This technotopian vision is there, and I believe the pandemic highlights a number of problems with the food system that these technologies have a chance of solving at least some of the problems. But I really want to conclude with this point. We should not be seduced by the easy answers of technology. We have to work across society to deploy these technologies in a way that are responsible, sustainable, equitable, just. It means working on a case-by-case basis, acknowledging that technologies work differently in different parts of the world. And I hope that from Aurélie and Nee's presentations, you've got a sense of some of the messy complexity of how you actually apply change. I also think that we need much greater collaboration between academics, government, industry, and we all have to drop our preconceived notions about how the world ought to work. So if I have one sort of Christmas wish that I hope comes early out of all the current predicament, it's that I think all of our status quos have been shaken so profoundly in the last 6 months that maybe there's an opportunity for us all to hit reset and come at something like the application of new technologies to the food system with a bit of a fresh mindset. And I'm optimistic that if we can put respectful dialogue together with things like creativity and ambition, then I think there's a chance that we may look back at 2020, at least from a food systems perspective, as maybe a moment when society pivoted and made things a little better. So thank you for the opportunity to finish off.
Thank you, Professor Fraser. Wise words. Professor Harou.
Thank you so much. I want to kind of conclude with kind of two main points, and to piggyback on Evan's example of the fertilizer example, throwing kind of fertilizer off the tractor. In comparison with precision agriculture, where you have very sophisticated tractors looking at each specific location within a plot to apply the right fertilizer. You know, when you look at the African context, a lot of the kind of fertilizer recommendations that are made and that farmers receive are based on kind of soil testing that was done back in the 90s. And they're given these broad blanket recommendations. And so farmers are applying perhaps the wrong fertilizer, if any fertilizer at all. And so you have really, you know, this very sophisticated tractor with precision fertilizer application and just not even knowing what fertilizer to apply. And so I want to really highlight the kind of discrepancy in technologies out there, and just really speak to the necessity of kind of bringing some of that technology and understanding how to adopt some of the technologies that are being developed in Canada and the US to the African continent. And the second point I want to mention is kind of related, and it relates also to Ni's point about, you know, having the very overweight husband and the malnourished woman, is just thinking about these inequalities that are kind of made worse by this pandemic. And understanding that, you know, the shock of the pandemic is being felt very differently by different, you know, industries. So both on the producer side, but also by consumers. And so again, also what emphasizing what Evan has said is, you know, the need to really tailor policies to specific contexts. And yeah, I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Professor Harou. And the last word, Dr. Addy.
Yeah, so I want to add not a whole lot to add to what my colleagues Evan and Aurelie have said. I think a key thing, you know, that I might just conclude with is this idea of the decision points that we have, right? Whether it's at the individual level, at the policy making level, where it's possible to actually change the system. And I think that's essentially some of what my colleagues have pointed out. So moving forward, what are these decision points that we are faced with, right? And how can we just enable that anxiety to lead to innovation and collaboration, as opposed to working in silos? So I'll end on that note, you know, to all of us, you know, what are the decision points that we have in addressing our anxieties?
Thank you very much, Dr. Addy. And this gets us to the end to today's event. I think we had an incredibly complimentary and interesting discussion on what the consequences of the current pandemic are for the agri-food system. But again, I think there's a lot of things that we can learn for the future as well. Before I want to conclude this event, I would like to thank, first of all, Dr. Addy, Professor Aurélie Harou, and Professor Evan Fraser for being our panelists here today. It was really wonderful to have all of you online and to share your wisdom with our alumni community, as well as with the Macdonald campus staff and students. I would also like to thank Professor Grant Clark, as well as Ingrid Shiraz from the OSAS office for organizing all of this, and of course our Anna Duff from the University Advancement Office at the faculty for pulling it all together. Thanks a lot for the logistics. All of this is of course always more complex than it looks like on screen. I would like to thank very much the Grandpré family for their loyal support to McGill, and in particular for allowing us, the Faculty of Agriculture and Environmental Sciences, to be the steward of this speaker series. I think every year brings incredibly interesting points, and we love to share what our own experts, as well as other experts, of course, Canada-wide, have to share with us. So thank you to all of you for chiming in during your own dinner time, or maybe post-dinner drink time. I hope you had that drink at home. We would love to welcome you for a real-life reception when it will become possible again, not today, but hopefully next time when the Grandpré lecture rolls around again, and that will be next year. Thank you to all of you, and good night.